Are there any fighter pilots on board?
At 40,000 feet, $1 billion in the bank cannot buy you a heartbeat when a catastrophic cockpit failure left a luxury private jet plummeting toward the icy Atlantic. A ruthless tech mogul learned that the only currency that mattered was the steady hand of the man she had just humiliated. The VIP terminal at Geneva Airport was a sanctuary of hushed voices, polished marble, and espresso that cost more than a standard commercial plane ticket. For Victoria Sterling, the billionaire CEO of Aegis Logistics, it was merely a waiting room for the inevitable. She checked her diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe watch, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the leather armrest of her chair. Her personal Gulfstream G700 had suffered a catastrophic hydraulic failure on the tarmac, an inconvenience that had cost her head of aviation his job with a single, icy phone call. Now, desperation had forced her onto a shared charter. It was an ultra-luxury boutique service utilizing a customized Embraer lineage, 1000E, designed to ferry the ultra-rich across the Atlantic when their own jets were unavailable. Victoria hated sharing airspace. To her, other people were unpredictable variables, and she had built her empire by eliminating variables. Boarding for Flight 88 to New York is now available, Miss Sterling. Her assistant, an anxious young man named Peter, whispered as he handed her a boarding pass. Victoria stood, pulling her cashmere Prada coat tight. Ensure my luggage is placed in the forward hold. I don't want to wait at Teterboro. She strode onto the tarmac, the biting Swiss winter wind barely registering against her annoyance. Stepping into the cabin of the Embraer, she was marginally placated. The interior was a cavernous expanse of cream leather, polished walnut, and ambient lighting. It was almost acceptable. She took her assigned seat in the front lounge section, immediately waving away the flight attendant offering a pre-departure champagne. Then, she saw them. Walking down the aisle toward the mid-cabin section was a man who looked entirely out of place amidst the mahogany and crystal. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a worn, faded canvas jacket that had seen better decades. His boots were scuffed leather, and on his wrist sat a cheap, battered Casio digital watch. But it wasn't just the man that made Victoria's upper lip curl in distaste. In his arms, he carried a little girl. She looked no older than 6, clutching a threadbare stuffed rabbit. The child was alarmingly pale, her dark hair tucked beneath a knit beanie, and she looked exhausted. The man, David Hayes, held her with a fierce, protective gentleness, murmuring softly to her as he navigated the aisle. As they passed Victoria's seat, the little girl's stuffed rabbit slipped from her grasp, tumbling onto the thick carpet and landing directly against the heel of Victoria's bespoke Italian leather pump. David stopped immediately. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. He knelt to retrieve the toy, his worn jacket brushing against the pristine upholstery of Victoria's suite. Victoria recoiled as if he had dropped a live grenade at her feet. She looked from the stuffed animal to David's face, her eyes narrowing with undisguised contempt. "Watch what you're doing," she snapped, her voice carrying through the quiet cabin. "This isn't a public bus." David paused, the rabbit in his hand. He looked up, his gray eyes calm but hardened by a life Victoria could not begin to comprehend. It was an accident. "My daughter is just tired." "I don't care if she's tired," Victoria scoffed, leaning back and crossing her arms. She looked over David's attire, performing a brutal, calculating assessment. "I was assured this was a premium charter. I wasn't aware they were handing out boarding passes to charity cases. Did you win a radio contest to get on this plane?" The flight attendant, a seasoned professional named Sarah, hurried over, her face pale. "Miss Sterling, please. Mr. Hayes is a paying passenger. He secured a seat through our medical transport partnership." "Medical transport?" Victoria let out a short, humorless laugh. "So, I am paying $50,000 for a transatlantic crossing to sit in a flying pediatric ward? This is a business environment, not a daycare for the destitute. If she starts crying over the Atlantic, I'll have the pilot divert." David stood up slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't puff out his chest. He simply looked down at Victoria with a steady, unnerving stillness. "Lily is traveling to Mount Sinai for a specialized cardiac procedure," David said quietly, his voice dangerously even. "We had to take this flight because a winter storm grounded commercial medical flights. We will not bother you." but I suggest you speak to my daughter with the respect she deserves, or you won't speak at all." Victoria blinked, momentarily taken aback by the absolute lack of fear in the man's eyes. Most men crumbled under her gaze. This man merely looked at her like she was a nuisance he had encountered on a muddy road. "Are you threatening me?" Victoria demanded, recovering her icy facade. "Peter! Get his name! When we land in New York, my legal team will ensure he never sets foot on an aircraft again." David ignored her. He turned his back, carrying his daughter to their seats a few rows behind. He gently buckled Lily in, wrapping a thick cashmere blanket provided by the airline around her small shoulders. "Daddy," Lily whispered, her voice frail, "is that lady mad at us?" "No, sweetheart," David said softly, kissing her forehead. "She's just mad at herself. Don't you worry about her. You just rest. We'll be in New York soon." Victoria watched the exchange, her jaw tight. She shoved a pair of noise-canceling headphones over her ears and opened her laptop, determined to ignore the riffraff that had somehow infiltrated her elite sanctuary. The twin Rolls-Royce engines roared to life, and the Embraer Lineage 1000E taxied down the runway, ascending into the dark, turbulent skies over Europe. For the first 3 hours, the flight was deceptively smooth. The massive aircraft cruised at 41,000 feet, soaring high above the heavy winter storm systems churning over the North Atlantic. In the cabin, the soft hum of the engines was the only sound. Victoria had spent the time aggressively typing out acquisition emails, drinking black coffee, and occasionally glaring at the back of David's head. David had not moved. He sat perfectly still, his hand resting on his sleeping daughter's arm, his eyes fixed out the window into the pitch-black night. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Lawson and First Officer Benjamin Miller were monitoring the screens. They were seasoned veterans of private aviation. But modern aircraft are incredibly complex machines, and sometimes failures do not announce themselves with blaring alarms or flashing red lights. Sometimes they are silent. Deep within the aircraft's bleed air system, the mechanism that takes hot, compressed air from the engines, cools it, and uses it to pressurize the cabin and flight deck, a hairline fracture had developed in a critical heat exchanger seal. At the same time, a faulty sensor failed to detect the slow, steady seepage of synthetic engine oil dripping onto the searing hot metal of the engine casing. The oil vaporized instantly, turning into a highly toxic, carbon monoxide-rich smoke. Because of a malfunctioning one-way valve, this invisible, odorless gas bypassed the main cabin entirely, funneling directly into the enclosed space of the flight deck. Hypoxia and carbon monoxide poisoning are notoriously deceptive. They don't induce choking or panic. They induce euphoria, followed by confusion, lethargy, and sleep. Captain Lawson felt a slight headache, which he dismissed as fatigue. 10 minutes later, he reached up to adjust the autopilot heading and found his arm felt like lead. He looked at First Officer Miller, intending to speak, but his words slurred into nonsense. Miller blinked, a hazy, confused smile on his face, before his chin dropped to his chest. Within minutes, both men were unconscious. The Embraer continued to fly on autopilot, a ghost ship tearing through the night sky. In the cabin, the first sign of trouble was the sudden, sharp jolt. The aircraft hit a pocket of clear air turbulence, causing the plane to bank violently to the left. The autopilot, programmed to disengage if the aircraft's attitude exceeded certain parameters without human input, instantly clicked off. A chime echoed through the cabin. Without the computer holding the yoke, the aircraft's nose began to pitch down. The gentle hum of the engines pitched into a higher, strained whine as the airspeed began to increase. Victoria's coffee spilled across her keyboard. "What in God's name is going on?" she shrieked, ripping off her headphones. "Sarah, tell the pilot to smooth this out." Sarah, the flight attendant, was already struggling to walk up the incline of the aisle. The cabin floor was tilting. She pressed the intercom button on the wall panel. "Captain Lawson, is everything all right up there?" "We had a sudden drop." There was no answer, only the hiss of static. Sarah pressed it again. "Captain? Ben? Please respond." Silence. The angle of the floor steepened. Loose items, magazines, iPads, silver spoons began to slide forward toward the cockpit door. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Sarah's chest. She stumbled to the reinforced cockpit door and entered the emergency access code. Beep, beep, beep. A red light flashed. It was designed with a time delay, If the pilots didn't manually deny entry, the door would unlock after 30 seconds. Those 30 seconds felt like a lifetime. The G-forces in the cabin were increasing. The plane was entering a shallow dive. Click! The heavy door unsealed. Sarah wrenched it open and peered inside. What she saw made the blood drain entirely from her face. Both pilots were slumped forward in their harnesses. The control columns were drifting freely. The altitude display on the primary flight display was unwinding at a terrifying speed, 38,000, 37,500. Saint-Wen-Liu-San. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. She reached in and shook the captain. "Richard! Richard, wake up!" His head lolled lifelessly. She tried to pull his oxygen mask down, but her own head suddenly swam. The air in the cockpit was thick, heavy, and tasted faintly of burnt metal. Instinctively, she backed out into the cabin, pulling the cockpit door shut to seal off the toxic air. Above their heads, the yellow plastic oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling compartments, swinging like pendulum blades in the dim light. The plane's automated systems had detected the change in cabin pressure caused by the steep dive. Sarah grabbed the PA microphone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold it. When she spoke, the polished, professional veneer was gone. It was the raw, primal voice of a terrified woman. "Attention, passengers," she cried out, her voice echoing over the screaming engines. "We have a critical emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated. Is there anyone on board with flight experience? Are there any pilots on board?" The words hung in the air, a death sentence delivered at 1,000 miles an hour. Victoria Sterling froze. The color vanished from her perfectly contoured face. Her immense wealth, her stock options, her real estate portfolio, none of it meant anything. She looked at her phone. There was no signal. She was trapped in a metal tube, hurtling toward the ocean. "What do you mean, incapacitated?" Victoria screamed, unbuckling her seatbelt and staggering into the aisle, fighting the downward tilt of the plane. "Wake them up! I am Victoria Sterling. I demand you wake them up right now. I will pay you anything. I will buy this airline." Sarah was weeping, struggling to strap herself into a jump seat. "Ma'am, sit down. Put your mask on. We're diving." Victoria was hyperventilating, staggering blindly. "Do something! Do something!" she shrieked. The facade of the untouchable CEO completely shattered, replaced by the pathetic wailing of a woman who had never been told no by the universe. In the back of the cabin, David Hayes had already secured the yellow mask over his daughter's face. He tightened the straps with practiced, terrifyingly calm efficiency. He stroked Lily's cheek once. "Stay right here, baby girl," he said, his voice cutting through the panic of the cabin like a steel blade. "Daddy has to go to work." David unbuckled his seatbelt. He didn't stumble. Despite the plane pitching downward at a 30-degree angle, he moved with the balanced, kinetic grace of a man who had spent his entire adult life operating in high-G environments. As he walked past the forward lounge, Victoria grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his worn canvas jacket. "Where are you going?" she sobbed hysterically. "We're going to die. Do you know who I am? We're going to die." David looked down at her hand, then up at her tear-streaked, terrified face. The disgust in his eyes was gone, replaced by the absolute, cold detachment of a combat veteran assessing a liability. "Let go of my jacket, Miss Sterling," David commanded softly. "What are you doing?" she cried. "I'm going to fly the plane," David said. He peeled her trembling fingers off his sleeve. "Now sit down, shut up, and put your mask on before you pass out." He didn't wait for her response. David pushed past the hysterical billionaire and strode toward the cockpit, his boots stepping over Victoria's spilled coffee. He grabbed Sarah by the shoulder as he passed her. "Get on portable oxygen," he ordered, his tone suddenly possessing unquestionable authority. "Drag the first officer out of the right seat the second I get the door open. Do not breathe the air in there." Sarah nodded dumbly. Who are you?" David gripped the handle of the cockpit door. "Commander David Hayes, United States Navy, F/A-18 strike fighter pilot." He threw open the door and stepped into the abyss. The cockpit of the Embraer lineage 1000E was a sensory nightmare. The moment David breached the threshold, the acrid, metallic stench of vaporized synthetic oil hit the back of his throat like battery acid. The master warning alarms were shrieking a relentless, deafening electronic wail that signaled an aircraft pushed far beyond its structural limits. Through the massive windshield, there was nothing but the dizzying, terrifying rotation of the black ocean rushing up to meet them. David held his breath, his eyes stinging. He moved with brutal efficiency, grabbing the quick-donning oxygen mask from the side console of the first officer's seat. He snapped it over his face, inhaling deeply as the pure, pressurized oxygen flushed the toxic fumes from his lungs. "Pull him!" David roared through the mask's built-in microphone, grabbing First Officer Miller by his uniform collar. Sarah, trembling but fueled by pure adrenaline, hooked her arms under Miller's armpits. With David shoving from the front and Sarah pulling from the cabin, they managed to drag the unconscious co-pilot out of the right seat and onto the tilted floor of the galley. David threw himself into the right seat, ignoring the 5-point harness for the moment. His hands flew over the unfamiliar yoke and center pedestal. An FA-18 Super Hornet was a nimble, fly-by-wire fighter jet designed to pull 9 Gs. The Embraer was a 120,000-pound luxury hotel, plunging toward the Atlantic at a near-vertical angle. The physics, however, remained the same. The airspeed indicator tape on the primary flight display was flashing red. They were passing Mach 0.85, dangerously close to the aircraft's structural limit. If they went any faster, the aerodynamic forces would simply rip the wings off the fuselage. David slammed the thrust levers all the way back to flight idle. He reached for the speed brake lever and deployed the spoilers to their maximum setting. The aircraft shuddered violently, protesting the sudden drag, vibrating so hard the rivets groaned. Overspeed. Overspeed. The automated voice of the flight computer was cold and mechanical. "Come on, you heavy beast!" David gritted his teeth, wrapping both hands around the yoke. In a dive this steep, pulling back too hard would cause an immediate high-speed stall or catastrophic structural failure. He had to ease it out of the dive, millimeter by millimeter. He planted his boots on the rudder pedals for leverage and pulled back. The yoke felt like it was set in concrete. The aerodynamic pressure on the elevators was immense. In the cabin, the G-forces hit like a physical blow. Victoria Sterling was thrown back into her plush leather seat, pinned against the upholstery by an invisible weight. Her breath left her lungs in a sharp gasp. The cabin lights flickered, and the sound of the wind tearing across the fuselage sounded like a freight train passing inches from her ears. She turned her head, her neck straining against the G-force, and looked toward the back of the plane. Lily was sitting quietly, her small hands clutching the armrests, her yellow oxygen mask secured tightly over her face. She wasn't crying. She was staring straight ahead at the cockpit door, her trust in her father absolute and unwavering. Victoria felt a sickening lurch in her stomach that had nothing less to do with the altitude and everything to do with her own hollow soul. She had built an empire on the premise of absolute control. She bought companies, destroyed rivals, and fired loyal employees over minor inconveniences. She had looked at David Hayes, a man in a faded jacket, holding a sick child, and deemed him worthless. Now, her billions were effectively monopoly money. The platinum credit cards in her Prada bag couldn't bribe gravity. Her life rested entirely in the calloused hands of the man she had mocked. Terrain. Terrain. Pull up. The ground proximity warning system kicked in. They had plummeted through the storm clouds and were now under 10,000 feet. Through the cockpit window, the whitecaps of the churning, freezing Atlantic Ocean were visible, illuminated by the aircraft's landing lights. "Not today," David snarled, his biceps straining against his canvas jacket. He pulled the yoke back harder, fighting the heavy, sluggish controls. The nose of the Embraer began to rise, slowly, agonizingly slowly. The altimeter unwound. 8,000, 6,000, 4,000. With a deafening groan of stressed metal, the aircraft's nose finally pitched up past the horizon. The G-forces shifted from crushing them backward to slamming them downward. The Embraer leveled off at exactly 2,800 feet above the raging ocean, skimming the tops of the storm clouds. David immediately pushed the thrust levers forward to maintain airspeed, leveling the wings. The overspeed warning ceased. The terrain alarm silenced. The only sound was the heavy, strained roar of the twin engines and David's ragged breathing through his oxygen mask. He had saved them from the dive. But the nightmare was just beginning. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is civilian charter flight 88. We have experienced a sudden depressurization and incapacitation of the flight crew. I am a passenger at the controls. Requesting immediate vectors to the nearest runway. David's voice was remarkably steady as he transmitted on the emergency frequency, 121.5. He had engaged the autopilot to hold their current altitude and heading while he assessed the damage. The radio cracked. Flight 88, this is Gander Center. We read your mayday. Radar contact established. You are currently 200 miles southeast of Newfoundland. State your souls on board and aircraft status. We have 5 souls on board, David replied, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar glass cockpit displays. 2 incapacitated pilots, 2 passengers, 1 flight attendant. Aircraft is flying, but David stopped, his eyes locked onto the engine indicating and crew alerting system, EIC, screen. A cascade of amber and red messages was filling the display. The right engine's oil pressure was dropping rapidly, and the exhaust gas temperature was spiking into the red zone. The bleed air leak that had poisoned the pilots had now compromised the engine's internal seals. A sudden, jarring bang echoed through the right side of the aircraft, followed by a violent yaw to the right. Flight 88, we have a catastrophic failure in the number 2 engine, David reported, his hands flying to the overhead panel to run the memory items for an engine fire. He pulled the right engine fire handle and twisted it, discharging the halon fire suppression bottles into the engine nacelle. The yaw stabilized, but the plane felt sluggish, fighting to maintain altitude on a single General Electric engine while weighed down by thousands of pounds of transatlantic fuel. Flight 88, Gander Center copies. Nearest suitable airport is Gander International, CYQX. Turn right heading 300. Be advised, Gander is currently experiencing a severe winter whiteout. Visibility is less than a quarter mile, winds gusting to 40 knots. A blizzard. They were limping on one engine, heavy, flown by a fighter pilot unfamiliar with the airframe, into a zero visibility blizzard. David swallowed hard. Copy that, Gander, turning to 300. He stripped off his oxygen mask. The toxic fumes had largely been vented out by the lower altitude air, though the smell of burnt wiring lingered. He unbuckled his harness and leaned back, looking through the open cockpit door. Sarah was kneeling on the floor, administering emergency oxygen to the pilots from a portable bottle. Victoria Sterling was still in her seat, her face ashen, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't unclasp her seatbelt. "Sarah," David called out. The flight attendant looked up, her eyes wide with terror. "Are we okay?" "We're flying. But we lost an engine, and we're diverting to Newfoundland into a snowstorm," David said bluntly. He didn't have time to sugarcoat it. "I need you to prep the cabin for a hard landing. Secure all loose items. Put the pilots in the jump seats and strap them down." He then looked directly at Victoria. The billionaire CEO, the woman who commanded boardrooms and dictated global markets, looked like a frightened, hollowed-out shell. She met David's eyes, expecting the resentment she so richly deserved. She expected him to mock her. She expected him to leave her to her panic. Instead, David pointed a firm, authoritative finger at her. "Miss Sterling," Victoria flinched. "I can't. I don't know what to do." "I didn't ask what you know," David snapped, his voice sharp and commanding, cutting right through her shock. "I need an able body, and you're it. Get out of that seat." Victoria mechanically unbuckled her belt. She staggered forward, the floor of the aircraft vibrating violently from the asymmetrical thrust of the single engine. "Get in the left seat," David ordered, pointing to the captain's empty chair. "What? I can't fly," Victoria gasped, backing away. "Are you insane?" "You're not flying." "I am," David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But I have 2 hands, and I need 4. My co-pilot is unconscious, and Sarah needs to secure the cabin and my daughter. You are going to sit in that seat, put on this headset, and you are going to read the checklists exactly as I tell you to. Do you understand me?" Victoria stared at him. The man's face was pale, a thin cut on his forehead bleeding slightly where he had hit it during the dive. He wasn't a charity case. He was the most focused, terrifyingly competent human being she had ever met. "I understand," Victoria whispered. She crawled into the left seat, trembling as she strapped the 5-point harness over her Prada coat. She put the heavy aviation headset over her ears. "Good," David said, his eyes never leaving the instruments. "Now, open the quick reference handbook in the side pocket next to your knee. Find the tab that says Single Engine Approach. You are going to read it to me, line by line, loud and clear. If we miss a step, we die. If you freeze, we die. Do we have a deal, Victoria?" It was the first time he had used her first name. It wasn't spoken with respect for her wealth, but with the demanding camaraderie of a commander assigning a critical task to a subordinate in a war zone. Victoria swallowed her fear. She pulled the heavy binder from the pocket and opened it to the index. Her hands stopped shaking. The sheer, overwhelming necessity of the moment stripped away her ego, her pride, and her arrogance, leaving only a desperate need to be useful. Line 1, Victoria said, her voice finding a sudden, surprising strength. Auto-throttle. Disengage. Disengaged, David confirmed, his hand adjusting the thrust lever. They flew into the blinding white wall of the Canadian blizzard, a billionaire and a single father, tethered together by a heavy binder and a prayer, while the fuel gauges dropped and the ice began to form on the wings. The cockpit of the crippled Embraer lineage 1000E was a tomb of concentrated focus. Outside the reinforced windshield, there was no sky, no horizon, and no ground, only a swirling, hypnotic vortex of white snow illuminated by the aircraft's landing lights. The wind howled against the fuselage, tossing the heavy jet like a toy in a bathtub. Flaps to position 3, David commanded, his voice tight but remarkably even. His hands wrestled the yoke, fighting the brutal crosswinds, trying to blow them off the glide slope. Victoria's finger traced the text in the quick reference handbook. She reached up to the flap lever, a mechanism she hadn't known existed an hour ago. Flaps position 3. Set, she confirmed, pushing the lever down until it clicked into the detent. The aircraft shuddered as the aerodynamic drag increased, slowing their descent. They were passing through 2,000 feet. Gear down, David barked. Victoria grabbed the landing gear lever, shaped like a small wheel, and pulled it down. 3 heavy thuds echoed beneath the floorboards, followed by 3 green lights illuminating on the center panel. Gear down and locked, she replied, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Gander Tower, Flight 88 is on short final. David transmitted over the radio. Flight 88, you are cleared to land runway 0-3. Winds are 050 at 35 knots, gusting to 45. Rescue equipment is standing by. Godspeed. Read me the final approach speeds. Victoria. Don't look out the window. Look at the book. Victoria swallowed hard, forcing her eyes down to the page. VREF is 142 knots. Speed is 145, David muttered, checking his display. We're heavy, and we only have 1 thrust reverser. This is going to be ugly. Brace yourself. At 200 feet, the runway lights finally pierced the blizzard, 2 glowing, hazy lines in a sea of absolute white. The plane was crabbing heavily, flying almost sideways to counteract the violent crosswind. 50 feet, the automated voice called out. David waited until the absolute last millisecond. 20, 10. With a brutal kick to the left rudder pedal and a simultaneous roll of the yoke to the right, David aligned the nose of the Embraer with the center line. The heavy main landing gear slammed onto the icy asphalt with a bone-jarring impact. David immediately deployed the speed brakes and slammed the single functional thrust lever into maximum reverse. The asymmetrical thrust threatened to spin them off the runway into the snowbanks. David danced on the rudder pedals, fighting for every inch of control as the anti-skid brakes ground against the ice. The end of the runway was rushing up fast, a solid wall of darkness beyond the tarmac. Victoria squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. The roar of the reverse thruster was deafening. The plane skidded, shuddered, and then, agonizingly slowly, the speed bled away. With less than 400 feet of runway remaining, the Embraer came to a complete, shuddering halt. For 10 seconds, the only sound in the cockpit was the howling of the blizzard outside and the ragged, desperate panting of the 2 unlikely pilots. David killed the remaining engine. The heavy silence that followed was broken only by the flashing lights of the Gander fire rescue trucks surrounding the aircraft. David took off his headset and let it drop to the floor. He looked over at Victoria. She was trembling violently, tears streaming down her face, her perfect blowout ruined, her Prada coat wrinkled. She had never looked more human. "Good job, co-pilot," David said softly. Victoria let out a breathless, broken laugh, unbuckling her harness. "I read a book." "You didn't panic," David corrected. "That's more than most." He didn't wait for a response. David vaulted out of his seat and sprinted into the cabin. The emergency response was chaotic but efficient. EMTs in heavy parkas swarmed the aircraft. Captain Lawson and First Officer Miller were loaded onto stretchers, barely conscious but alive. Then, David reached Lily's row. The little girl was slumped over in her seat. The extreme stress of the dive, the pressure changes, and the sheer terror of the flight had been too much for her fragile, failing heart. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. "Lily!" David screamed, his stoic facade finally shattering. He scooped her into his arms. "Medic! I need a medic right now." 30 minutes later, the reality of their situation crashed down upon them in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room of the James Peyton Memorial Hospital in Gander. Victoria sat in a plastic chair, a thermal blanket draped over her shoulders. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. She watched David pacing the hallway. He looked 10 years older, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling as he held Lily's stuffed rabbit. A doctor wearing scrubs emerged through the double doors. David stopped dead. "Mr. Hayes," the doctor said, his expression grim. "Your daughter is stable for the moment, but her condition has deteriorated rapidly due to the trauma of the flight. She needs that specialized mitral valve repair immediately. Her heart is failing." "Then do it," David pleaded, his voice cracking. "Do whatever it takes." The doctor shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry, we are a regional hospital. We don't have the pediatric cardiothoracic surgical team, nor the specific bypass equipment required for a child her size. She needs to be at Mount Sinai." "Then fly her there." "We can't," the doctor said quietly. "The blizzard has grounded everything on the eastern seaboard. No medical helicopter or civilian transport can take off in these winds. By the time the storm breaks tomorrow afternoon, I'm afraid she won't make it." David stumbled backward as if he had been shot. He collapsed against the hospital wall, sliding down to the floor, burying his face in his hands. The man who had wrestled a 100-ton aircraft out of a death dive, the fighter pilot who had stared down gravity and won, was completely broken by a storm he couldn't fight. Victoria watched him. She remembered the disgust she had felt looking at his worn boots. She remembered threatening to sue him. She remembered the cold, unwavering trust in Lily's eyes as the plane plummeted. A strange, unfamiliar sensation bloomed in Victoria's chest. It was a terrifying mixture of profound guilt and absolute fierce resolve. She stood up, letting the thermal blanket fall to the floor. She walked over to the nurse's station and demanded the landline phone. She dialed a number she knew by heart, the direct, encrypted line to the chief operating officer of Aegis Logistics in London. "It's Sterling," Victoria barked the moment the line connected. "Victoria!" "Thank God," the FAA reported, "your charter went down." "Shut up and listen to me, Richard," Victoria interrupted, her voice possessing a lethal, cutting edge that made her billions. "Where is our C-130J Super Hercules?" "The one we retrofitted for extreme weather cargo ops in the Arctic. It's at the staging base in Halifax. But Victoria, there's a Category 3 blizzard." "I don't care if there's a hurricane made of fire," Victoria snapped. "I want that Hercules fueled and in the air in 20 minutes. It is rated for zero visibility tactical landings. I want it flown directly to Teterboro Airport in New York." "Teterboro? Why?" "Because you are going to call the Chief of Pediatric Surgery at Mount Sinai, Dr. William Herring. You will tell him that Aegis Logistics is donating $50 million to his department, effective immediately, on the condition that he and his surgical team, along with a pediatric bypass machine, get on that Hercules." There was a stunned silence on the line. "Victoria, that aircraft costs $50,000 an hour to operate. The liability of flying civilians into a storm, the board will have a stroke." "Let them," Victoria snarled. "I own 51% of the voting shares. If anyone objects, fire them. If the pilot refuses to fly, offer him $2 million cash. That Hercules lands in Gander, drops off the surgical team, and saves a little girl's life tonight, or I swear to God, Richard, I will burn Aegis Logistics to the ground and dance in the ashes. Get it done." She slammed the phone down. She turned around to find David standing a few feet away, staring at her in absolute disbelief. Victoria walked over to him. The icy billionaire facade was completely gone. She looked at the man who had saved her life, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The surgical team is coming," Victoria said quietly. "They'll be here in 3 hours." David stared at her, his jaw tight. "Why are you doing this?" "Because," Victoria swallowed hard, "at 40,000 feet, my money couldn't buy a heartbeat. You gave me my life, David. It's time I did something worthwhile with it. 3 hours later, the massive, four-engine military-grade Hercules roared through the blizzard, touching down on the icy runway at Gander. Dr. Herring and his team were rushed by police escort to the hospital. As the sun rose the next morning, painting the snow-covered town in brilliant gold, Dr. Herring stepped into the waiting room. He looked exhausted, but he was smiling. "The surgery was a success," he announced. "Lily's heart is strong. She's going to make a full recovery." David wept. He collapsed into a chair, sobbing with the sheer, overwhelming relief of a father who had pulled his child back from the brink of the abyss. Victoria stood by the window, watching the sun reflect off the snow. She didn't check her emails. She didn't look at the stock market. For the first time in her life, she felt truly, genuinely wealthy. In the end, Victoria Sterling learned that true power wasn't measured in offshore accounts or corporate acquisitions, but in the steady hands of a father fighting for his child. She transformed Aegis Logistics into the world's leading pediatric medical transport fleet, naming the flagship aircraft Lily. At 40,000 feet, a ruthless billionaire was humbled, saved by the very grace she had once dared to mock.
Hi, my name is Shalom Royal Hunger, the owner and manager of Shalom Royal Hunger. After watching the video, the CEO mocked the single father, then Fate called, "Are there any fighter pilots on board?" I'd really like to know what you think. How did the story make you feel? What stayed with me most was how quickly people can judge someone without knowing anything about their past or what they're capable of. The single father carried himself quietly, but when the moment truly mattered, his experience and courage spoke for themselves. I think the story does a good job reminding us that humility and character often matter more than status or appearances. Do you think people today rely too much on first impressions? And have you ever been surprised by someone after learning their real story? It also makes me think about how important it is to treat others with respect, because we never really know what someone has lived through or what they may one day do for others. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional stories like this, feel free to like and subscribe for more whenever you're ready.